The Strait of Hormuz represents one of the most strategically consequential maritime corridors in the contemporary international order. Spanning merely 21 miles at its narrowest point, this waterway serves as the primary transit route for approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply, rendering it not merely a geographic feature, but a critical artery of global economic stability. It is within this context of extraordinary strategic sensitivity that a recent naval confrontation between the United States and the People's Republic of China must be understood, not as an isolated incident of maritime brinkmanship, but as a deliberate and carefully calculated episode within a broader pattern of Chinese strategic assertiveness directed at reshaping the balance of power in a region long dominated by American military presence. The immediate circumstances of the confrontation began with what American officials described as a routine freedom of navigation operation conducted by a U.S. Navy carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf. Such operations are standard practice under customary international law and long-standing American naval doctrine, intended to assert the principle that international waters remain open to all nations. However, the operational environment was far from routine. Chinese naval vessels, including at least one destroyer accompanied by 2 support ships, had been stationed in the broader Gulf region for several weeks prior to the incident, with Beijing formally characterizing their presence as participation in anti-piracy cooperation and joint exercises with regional partners. This diplomatic framing, while superficially plausible, obscured a more calculated strategic reality. The deliberate prepositioning of Chinese naval assets in this region represented a carefully orchestrated deployment rather than an incidental presence, a distinction that intelligence communities recognize even as Washington initially chose observation over confrontation. The confrontation escalated decisively in the hours before dawn local time, when Chinese warships abruptly altered their course directly toward the American naval formation at a speed sufficient to trigger immediate alerts across U.S. radar systems. Radio communications were exchanged rapidly between both sides, with American commanders demanding clarification of Chinese intent. The responses received were, by all available accounts, terse and deliberately provocative in their content. Chinese naval officers, communicating in English over open channels, declared that their vessels were conducting their own freedom of navigation exercise, employing language strikingly similar to the very formulations used by the United States to justify its own naval operations. This linguistic mirroring was plainly intentional, a form of calculated diplomatic provocation designed to invert American rhetorical conventions and signal that China possessed both the capability and the willingness to contest American maritime precedents on their own terms. For a period of approximately 30 minutes, both naval formations maintained courses that risked a dangerous close encounter, with sailors on each side at battle stations, fire control systems active, and sensor arrays locked onto opposing vessels. The gravity of this standoff cannot be overstated. Any miscommunication, technical malfunction, or error of judgment during those 30 minutes carried the potential to precipitate a confrontation between 2 nuclear-capable powers in one of the world's most economically vital waterways. To understand why China initiated this confrontation, it is necessary to situate the incident within the broader arc of Chinese strategic development and foreign policy doctrine. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, and a substantial proportion of that oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. From Beijing's strategic perspective, the dependence on American goodwill and naval dominance to ensure the security of these shipping lanes constitutes an unacceptable structural vulnerability, one that Chinese defense planners have sought systematically to address over the preceding decade. China's naval capabilities have expanded dramatically in this period. The People's Liberation Army Navy now operates multiple aircraft carriers, commands a modern and rapidly growing destroyer fleet, and is developing one of the most capable submarine forces in the world. Alongside these material investments, China has cultivated the operational doctrine and institutional confidence necessary to project naval power far beyond its home waters. The Hormuz confrontation was therefore not a spontaneous act, but the product of sustained, deliberate military development oriented toward establishing China as a consequential actor in regions previously regarded as exclusively within the American sphere of strategic influence. The timing of the incident further illuminates its strategic logic. The confrontation occurred against a backdrop of heightened diplomatic tension between Washington and Beijing across multiple issue areas, including Taiwan, bilateral trade disputes, and restrictions on technology transfer. Chinese leadership has a well-documented tendency to employ military signaling as a communicative instrument when diplomatic channels are strained or unproductive. By engineering a confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, Beijing simultaneously communicated resolve to Washington, demonstrated strength to its domestic audience, and served notice to Gulf states that China is an indispensable regional actor regardless of American preferences. This multi-audience signaling is characteristic of Chinese strategic communication and reflects a sophisticated understanding of how military incidents function as instruments of political messaging in the contemporary international environment. The position of Gulf states in this emerging competition deserves particular analytical attention. For decades, the security architectures of Gulf governments have been built upon American military guarantees, reinforced by basing agreements, arms transfers, and the persistent presence of U.S. naval forces. Yet these same governments have in recent years substantially deepened their economic and diplomatic engagement with China, creating a structural tension between their security dependencies and their evolving economic interests. The Hormuz confrontation placed Gulf capitals in the uncomfortable position of being forced to evaluate the reliability of American security commitments against the growing weight of Chinese economic and political influence. If Beijing can successfully cultivate doubt regarding American staying power and resolve, Gulf states may become more reluctant to support American-led military operations, share intelligence with Washington, or maintain the basing arrangements upon which American regional strategy depends. This erosion of Allied confidence, even if incremental, constitutes a form of strategic leverage that China has demonstrated considerable sophistication in exploiting. The American response to the confrontation was notable for both its speed and its coherence. U.S. Central Command issued a public statement with unusual promptness, characterizing Chinese naval behavior as unprofessional and dangerous, while affirming that American forces had maintained their lawful course throughout the incident. This rapid assumption of the public narrative reflected a deliberate effort to establish the factual record before China could advance its own characterization of events. Concurrently, the United States accelerated the deployment of additional naval assets to the Gulf region, significantly increasing American military presence in and around the strait within 48 hours of the confrontation. This force augmentation served as a direct countermessage to Chinese attempts to use proximity and presence as instruments of coercion. At the diplomatic level, senior American officials engaged their counterparts in Gulf partner nations in substantive discussions covering base access, intelligence sharing arrangements, and contingency planning, conversations designed to reassure regional partners of the durability of American security commitments at precisely the moment China was seeking to cast those commitments in doubt. China's response to American public statements followed predictable patterns, with official spokespersons denying any wrongdoing, asserting compliance with international law, and accusing Washington of fabricating a confrontation for domestic political purposes. This denial, however, was rendered unconvincing by the objective record. Radar tracking data and communications logs from the incident demonstrated with clarity that the Chinese course alteration was deliberate, precisely timed, and executed at speeds inconsistent with any innocent navigational purpose. Senior American naval officers who were present or had direct access to operational records described the Chinese maneuver as the most aggressive they had personally observed in an active deployment, a characterization that warrants serious weight given the professional caution with which experienced military officers typically discuss such matters. The Hormuz incident is best understood not in isolation, but as the most recent manifestation of a consistent and accelerating pattern of Chinese military assertiveness across multiple geographic theaters. In the South China Sea, China has constructed and militarized artificial islands in defiance of international arbitral rulings. In the waters surrounding Taiwan, Chinese air and naval exercises have grown in scale and provocative intent. In the East China Sea, persistent tensions with Japan reflect ongoing Chinese pressure against the existing territorial and maritime order. Each of these theaters exhibits the same underlying logic. China is systematically testing the thresholds of American tolerance, observing responses, and calibrating subsequent actions accordingly. This methodical probing of American red lines constitutes what defense analysts have termed gray zone competition, the contested space between conventional peace and open armed conflict in which the most consequential aspects of strategic rivalry increasingly unfold. Managing gray zone competition presents genuine difficulties for American strategic planners. Responses that are too forceful risk inadvertent escalation toward open conflict. Responses that are too restrained risk communicating that Chinese pressure tactics are producing the desired results. The American response to the Hormuz confrontation, rapid public communication, accelerated force deployment, and intensive diplomatic engagement with regional partners represented an attempt to thread this needle, signaling resolve and capability without creating the conditions for miscalculation. Whether the calibration achieved was precisely optimal will be a matter of scholarly and policy debate for years. What is clear is that Washington demonstrated the capacity for rapid, coordinated response across military and diplomatic dimensions simultaneously, a capability whose visible exercise carries its own deterrent value. The trajectory of this competition in the Gulf region is unlikely to stabilize in the near term. China's strategic interests in the security of Gulf shipping lanes are real and structurally durable. Its naval capabilities will continue to expand, and its domestic political environment sustains incentives for leadership to demonstrate external strength rather than restraint. The United States, for its part, cannot credibly withdraw from a region in which it has invested decades of military presence, treaty relationships, and strategic capital without accepting severe consequences for its global credibility and alliance relationships. The result is a dynamic in which two great powers with incompatible short-term objectives are increasingly in direct contact in a confined, heavily trafficked, and economically vital waterway. The robustness of existing communication channels, rules of engagement protocols, and diplomatic back channels will ultimately determine whether this competition can be managed without catastrophic miscalculation. The Strait of Hormuz confrontation was, in this sense, simultaneously a warning and a test. A warning of the tensions inherent in an era of great power naval competition, and a test of whether the institutional and diplomatic frameworks available to both sides are sufficient to prevent the next such incident from crossing the threshold from confrontation to conflict.